What you're about to hear is one of the most explosive political debates we've seen in a long time. At the center of it is a devastating missile strike on a school in Iran that reportedly killed more than 150 people, many of them children. And now the biggest question is this: who is telling the truth? Because notice what happened here. First came denial, then confusion, then accusations of propaganda, targeting failures, and even possible war crimes. And honestly, that pattern feels very familiar to a lot of people watching around the world. This debate quickly became bigger than just one strike. It turned into a larger argument about media narratives, military accountability, and how wars are sold to the public. On one side, investigative journalists presented evidence suggesting the attack was carried out using U.S. weapons and questioned whether outdated intelligence or reckless targeting led to the deaths of civilians. On the other side, military voices argued that terrorist groups often operate near civilian areas and that tragic mistakes can happen during war without intentional wrongdoing. And this is where things get interesting. The conversation exposed a growing collapse of public trust. People no longer automatically believe governments, media outlets, or official military explanations. Every side is accusing the other of manipulation and propaganda. That's why this clip is going viral, because this wasn't just politics anymore. It became a debate about truth, morality, media narratives, and the human cost of war. And once children become part of the story, the emotional and political impact becomes impossible to ignore.
But Scott, this whole strike on this school, obviously utterly devastating in terms of loss of life, particularly young children. The Sky News report from the guy on the ground makes it crystal clear that this was not part of any IRGC compound, as the early spin wanted us to believe, which begs the question, they must know who has fired this Tomahawk missile. They don't just get fired randomly. Why is there such a concerted effort not to admit what happened?
Well, I'm sure it was a targeting mistake. And yes, they should have just apologized immediately and said, well, we didn't mean for that to happen. Now, my best understanding, and you have the New York Times reporters right here whose work I'm referring to here, they seem to show that this used to be part of the same compound, but then they just built a wall and separated it. And they showed where the strikes on all the different buildings, virtually all of the different buildings in that compound, looked just the same as this one. And then it was the Washington Post that published video of a Tomahawk incoming that hit another one of the buildings just adjacent to the school there. So apparently this, I believe the Times reported this used to be part of an IRGC base. It was essentially on one big piece of property, but they had built a wall separating it back years ago. But the thing of it is from the Iranian people's point of view, it seems like we should at least take into account here that regardless of whether it was a mistake or not, just how absolutely horrific this was. And in all the casualties of all the wars, the numbers, get, taken in different contexts and scenarios and whatever. But I believe it was the leftist media critic Adam Johnson who first pointed out that the casualty count here is essentially equivalent to the Oklahoma City bombing. Only if that entire federal building had been the daycare center, 167 killed, all little girls. And this is the kind of, it's one of the things that goes to show why we should not be starting aggressive wars in the first place, is because mistakes like this can happen and become an absolute stain on this country.
Okay, Malachy Brown, welcome to Uncensored. What do we know for a fact about this, do you think?
What we know for a fact is that, yes, multiple buildings in that area were targeted. And yes, the school building is adjacent to the IRGC facility. according to experts that I've since spoken to since our early reports, it's not uncommon for these IRGC bases, much like American bases, to have schools for the children of the serving members of the IRGC. This particular school was opened up to the public a few years ago, cordoned off from the site, public entrances opened. Other parts of the site also repurposed for public use as a medical clinic and a cultural center there as well. And witnesses, or not witnesses, but sources that we've spoken to say that, yeah, there weren't weapons stored there, that it was more of a logistics hub than, a base that was used to store cruise missiles. And why would you store explosives right beside the school that your kids are going to? We know it was hit in that early salvo on the first day of the war, the start of the working week when school was in session. Teachers had called parents to collect their kids once the war started, but by the time that most parents got there, the school building had been hit, devastating consequences. There was a second wave of attacks a couple of hours later on that same area and facility. There have been some reports, we haven't been able to confirm them, that the school was hit twice, including the Sky News report with an eyewitness who has survived the attack. But that's what we know so far. And then on the casualties, the original casualties were put at 175. The Iranian state has since revised that down to about 156. And Christian here, my colleague, and others have been able to corroborate that number.
After watching that entire exchange, one thing becomes crystal clear. This debate was never going to end with full agreement. In fact, the deeper the conversation went, the more divided everybody became. And honestly, that tells you everything. Because what we just witnessed was not simply a policy discussion, it was a collision between completely different worldviews about war, truth, morality, and power. Notice what happened throughout the panel. Every single person agreed that the deaths of children were horrific. Every single person acknowledged the tragedy. But after that point, the room split into entirely different moral and political directions. That's what makes this so explosive. Dodo, you had investigative journalists like Maliki Brown and Christian Treibert presenting detailed evidence suggesting the U.S. was responsible for the strike, raising serious questions about targeting failures, outdated intelligence, and potential recklessness. Then you had Ryan Bodenheimer, speaking from military experience, arguing that combat decisions are incredibly difficult, that pilots and operators are trained to avoid civilian casualties, and that terrorist organizations often exploit civilian environments strategically. And then Scott Horton took the conversation somewhere even more politically dangerous, because Scott wasn't just criticizing the strike itself. He was challenging the entire narrative surrounding the war. And this is where things became bigger than just one moment. When Horton started talking about inflated casualty figures, propaganda campaigns, public manipulation, and emotional war messaging, he tapped into something millions of people already feel deep down. That governments and media institutions often shape public opinion during conflicts before all the facts are known. That's why people online are reacting so strongly. Because this conversation exposed the growing distrust people have toward official narratives, whether those narratives come from governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, activist groups, or even major news organizations. And Piers Morgan understood exactly where the emotional pressure points were. That's why he kept pushing the panel on morality. Not legality, not military strategy, morality. Because the uncomfortable reality hanging over this entire discussion is that modern warfare increasingly blurs the line between military target and civilian catastrophe. And once children become part of the story, public perception changes instantly. Meanwhile, the geopolitical consequences of all this are enormous. If investigations continue pointing toward U.S. responsibility, pressure will grow internationally for accountability and transparency. Critics of American foreign policy will use this as evidence of recklessness and double standards. Supporters of military intervention will argue that tragic mistakes happen in every conflict and that Iran itself manipulates civilian suffering for strategic gain. And the media battle surrounding this story is only getting started. Because once competing narratives harden publicly, reversing them becomes almost impossible. People pick sides emotionally first, then they defend those sides politically afterward. That's the reality of modern political discourse. And in the middle of all of it are grieving families, dead children, traumatized civilians, and ordinary people trapped inside geopolitical power struggles far beyond their control. That's the part that often gets lost once the political warfare begins. At the end of the day, this debate exposed something deeply uncomfortable about modern politics and modern war. Everybody claims to care about civilian lives, but the outrage often depends on who fired the missile. And that contradiction is exactly why this conversation became so emotionally charged, so politically explosive, and so impossible for the internet to ignore. The frustration in that room was real. The tension was real. And the emotions surrounding this story are only getting stronger online. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just politics anymore. This became a debate about morality, truth, and the human cost of modern warfare. But I want to know what you think. Do you believe this was a tragic military mistake? Or do you think there's a bigger cover-up happening here? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next political analysis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.